Panem. In the center you've got Moses, okay, chiseled in stone, and he's holding the Ten Commandments, one on either side. And then to Moses' right, you have Confucius. And then on Moses' left, holding up what looks like a set of scrolls or whatever, you have Solon, the Greek philosopher. This is why I say Solon is kind of like the Greek version of Moses. Then you go to the House of Representatives, and you find a carved bust of Solon in the House of Representatives. This brings us to a guy who's really the central focus, probably, if I had to pick one character. The central focus of Secret Mysteries Volume 1 is Sir Francis Bacon. And in 1626, Bacon passed away. A year later, after he died, those who were a part of what is called the Baconian Circle, a lot of his followers, they published his final work, and it was a book called The New Atlantis. Now, what's very interesting is that when Plato wrote his Atlantis dialogue, it moves along and it builds up to this big climax and this crescendo, and then suddenly it stops. And the story doesn't have an ending. So now in Bacon's New Atlantis, you have the same thing. The story, it's basically, in a nutshell, it's the story of these Christian sailors who are lost at sea, and they come across this lost or this hidden island called Ben Salam. And they go into the land of Ben Salam, and they've never seen this place before, and they encounter this really advanced culture, and they're not sure what to make of it or what the proper customs are and so on. And then they meet one of the leaders of the House of Ben Salam, or not the House of Ben Salam, it's one of the leaders of Ben Salam, and it's called the House of Solomon. And Solomon, many Baconian writers and scholars believe, is a code name for Sir Francis Bacon. Bacon wrote about, in his own writings, he wrote about imitating the work of King Solomon. And it's based upon the proverb, the idea that it is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. So Bacon latched onto this idea, and he writes about it specifically. He latched onto this idea, and he said, well, I'm going to do a bunch of work in secret. And this is essentially what he did. Now, he has a lot of work that he did and that he published openly, but he was specifically known for developing work in secret. And he was the head during the Elizabethan era. This is about the time of Queen Elizabeth I, late 1500s, going into the 1600s, through Elizabeth I, and then King James I, who authorized the King James Bible. And under King James, Bacon would become the Lord High Chancellor of England, the keeper of the Great Seal. So he arose to a position of great prominence in England, and then he was suddenly disempowered at one point because he was accused of taking a bribe, and that's a whole big controversy. And King James would not allow him to defend himself. He was deposed as Chancellor of England, spent a few days in the Tower, had to pay a minor fine, and then he was released. And there's been all kinds of speculation as to why that happened. But he was a very prominent character during this Elizabethan era. Now, what's interesting is that Bacon, in his time, America had already been discovered. Bacon believed, as many of his contemporaries, that America, that the continent of America, was the site of ancient Atlantis. Not just a metaphor for Atlantis, not just a symbol for Atlantis, but that it was literally, physically, the Atlantean continent that had been rediscovered. Okay, and he writes in his book, The New Atlantis, he says, "And the great Atlantis, that you call America. Of all this there is with you sparing memory, or none, but we have large knowledge thereof." Now, he's writing about this really Ben Salam and this House of Solomon is a secret society, symbolically, because they talk about, the leader of Ben Salam talks about how their society observes all things, but they are known by no one. Not only that, there's a very telling phrase here when he says, "Of all this there is with you sparing memory or none." In other words, you don't know anything about Atlantis, but we have large knowledge thereof. Now, it becomes very telling when you realize that the ancient mystery religion, which is essentially what all of the secret societies believe in and practice, and that's the whole god and goddess worship of Egypt and Babylon and Greece and Rome, the whole pantheon of pagan gods. That is the belief system in general of the secret societies. Well, if you talk to these people who believe in and practice these things, they will tell you that all of the ancient mystery traditions go all the way back to Atlantis. And they believe that the first great king of Atlantis was Enoch. Okay? Enoch, the seventh from Adam, as we read in the Bible. You know, and Enoch walked with God, it says, and was not, for God took him. That Enoch. They believe because Atlantis is the antediluvian world, the pre-flood world. And of course, Atlantis being destroyed by a massive tidal wave, supposedly from the gods who were angry with the Atlantean kings, many people believe that Atlantis is simply another flood story. Well, in the occult, among those who practice and believe esoteric wisdom, they believe that Enoch was the first great king and also the first initiator of the mysteries. And so he initiated, supposedly, people into the ancient mystery religion. And so all the mysteries, so Atlantis plays a very important role when you're researching the mysteries, and of course the mystery religion is essentially the New Age religion. It's essentially the same belief system that has evolved and developed and so on for the New Age movement. Now, what's very interesting is that Bacon is not the only guy who believed that America was Atlantis. There are people who are New Agers, who are practitioners of New Age theology, who believe that Atlantis is America today, that believe that this is the continent, this is the site of ancient Atlantis. One of them is Dr. Robert Hieronymus. And we talk about Dr. Hieronymus in Secret Mysteries. Hieronymus wrote this book, America's Secret Destiny. Okay? And he's writing about a lot of the founding fathers, and he writes about them in a very esoteric manner. Hieronymus is considered to be the foremost expert on the Great Seal of the United States, that all-seeing eye with the eagle and so on the back of the dollar bill. His research has been used by the White House, by the State Department, by the Department of the Interior. Years ago, when Anwar Sadat was still alive, Sadat wanted to know about the Great Seal. What does it mean? Why? He saw the Egyptian pyramid on there and he thought, wow, maybe this has something to do with Egypt. So he went about trying to find out, and he was given Dr. Hieronymus' doctrinal thesis as an explanation. Well, Dr. Hieronymus believes, and we interviewed him, you're going to see him in Volume 2, if you see Secret Mysteries 2 on Washington, D.C., we interviewed Dr. Bob Hieronymus, Robert Hieronymus, for that as well. And he holds this view. Likewise, Benjamin Creme from Share International. Benjamin Creme just spoke at the United Nations in July of this year. Spoke to an NGO group at the UN. Then he came to speak to some groups, or at least one group, out in Los Angeles. While he was in Los Angeles being interviewed, he made mention of the fact that he believed that this continent, he said, right here where we are, this is the site of ancient Atlantis. And so this whole concept of resurrecting lost Atlantis, which is part of, I don't know if you could hear it in the opening quote from Dr. Stam, but he's talking about, you know, to spread this philosophic or democratic commonwealth around the world and rebuild lost Atlantis. And this is a recurring theme throughout the occult. Now, it's interesting, in the New Atlantis, Bacon writes, he says, at that time, he's talking about in ancient times, this land was known and frequented by the ships and vessels of all the nations before named. And then he talks about the Phoenicians, the Tyrians, the Carthaginians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, and the Palestinians. Okay, so he's talking about ancient Atlantis, and he's talking about how Atlantis, which now, at the time that he's writing, is but full of junks and canoes, he said. He's referring to the Indians, who went about in canoes. And he says, but